Good morning. Great to have each and every one of you. It's everybody thawed out, finally. What a blessing yesterday was, given everything that we experienced Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and some of Thursday morning as well. Well, there was two sisters. They went to church one morning, and they sat right on the front pew. That day, there was a guest preacher, was a rather fiery preacher, and he decided that he was going to be preaching on the sins of the world. And so as he stood up and he began to preach against stealing. And the two sisters immediately called out, "Amen, brother, amen." He went on and started to talk a little bit more about the sins of lust. Preach it, brother, they cried out. He then went on and began to preach about lying. And they said, "Go for it, brother, do it, amen." And then he went in and started to preach about gossip. And suddenly they fell silent. And one leaned over to the other and said, "He's gone from preaching to meddling right now." Well, sin, it's not something that we like to talk about very often. And the reality is most preachers don't like preaching about it very often as well. But as I laid out the sermons for this series and I got to the end, I suddenly realized that there was a gaping hole in the topics that were being addressed. And that is today's topic of sin itself. We don't like to talk about sin. We'd rather just kind of gloss it over and move on from that. But the reality is we're going to deal with it head on. And you're going to have to forgive me if I move from preaching to meddling just a little bit. But we have to be reminded by Paul's words that all have fallen short of the glory of God. Right? Because all have sinned. And so this is a topic for each and every one of us today. Now, how did sin enter the world? Well, you remember that Adam and Eve were created by the hands of God. And He created for them a perfect place to live, the Garden of Eden. It had everything that they could ever desire and everything that they could ever want. And God said, there are only three things I want you to do. Number one is, I want you to care for the garden. Second, I want you to have children. And third, don't eat of the fruit of the center of the tree in the center of the garden. Well, you know how the story unfolds. One day, Eve is out on a stroll, and the snake in the tree says, "Did God really say you shouldn't eat this fruit? Just look how luscious and delicious looking it looks. Don't you want a bite of this? Surely it won't do what God said." You know how it goes. Eve took her bite, and then she passed it over to Adam. And in that moment, when God came down in the afternoon for his stroll that he had with Adam and Eve each and every day, they suddenly were guilt-ridden. They began to cover themselves up because for the first time they knew that they were naked. But more than that, they felt shame because they had sinned against God's laws. And it is from that time that two things happened. That there is a separation between us and God, and that is the cause of sin itself. You remember that no longer could they stay in the Garden of Eden. Why? Because as we learned last week, our God is a holy God. And because our God is a holy God, He cannot be around sin. And so Adam and Eve were pushed out of the garden and into the world. The second thing is that since that generation, every person has struggled with sin in their lives. And this is the challenge for each and every one of us. We wrestle with sin. And we wrestle really for two reasons, because there are two voices that are always challenging us in our lives. The first is the voice of God, which calls us to His path, calls us to His will. And then secondly is the voice of self, which says, it's okay, you pursue your own desires. You really deserve a break today. You really need to get that. You really should want to have that. It's not going to hurt anybody. The reality is so often, whenever we are faced with a decision or whenever we are faced with some type of challenge in our life, we hear those two voices. And if we're really honest with ourselves, more often than not, we hear the voice of self more so than we hear the voice of God. But this is the challenge for us. Now hear this, we're not alone in this. I mean, even the Apostle Paul, the greatest theologian, the greatest evangelist, the greatest church planter that the church has ever known, struggled with sin himself when he said these words, "I don't understand